For Financial Literacy Month, PCN, in partnership with the Pennsylvania Bankers Association, presents Financial Insights.
We're joined today by Angie Sargent, first Vice Chair of the Pennsylvania Bankers Association, Board of Directors, and Senior Executive Vice President, Chief Information Officer with Fulton Bank. Today we're going to talk about protecting your money, which is one of the 5 pillars of financial literacy. What do we mean when we talk about the concept of protection?
So protection is so important in financial literacy. It has varied components to it, and I think the first one that comes to mind is a risk management component. And in banking and finance and protection, what that really is focused on is insurance. Having insurance for as much as you can in your life, but also emergency savings accounts are important. Another component when I think of protection is identity theft. I think we're all aware of that, unfortunately. And identity theft is really so critical because it's so hard to recoup finances from that, and it can take years to come back from an identity theft situation. And then finally, unfortunately, I think frauds and scams are a big part of the protect pillar. The old adage of if it sounds too good to be true, it most likely is. So those are the areas that I think of when I think of the protect pillar of financial literacy. Before
we get into deep with the topics that you just mentioned, for those that are not familiar, who is the Pennsylvania Bankers Association?
So the Pennsylvania Bankers Association is a member-driven organization of community banks, various sizes throughout the Commonwealth. About 120 banks make up the current membership. And it's an organization that is focused on helping financial institutions in a variety of ways. So they do it through education, advocacy for the financial institutions, various resources, products, and services are provided to the banks throughout the Commonwealth. And I just want to say that it's great to partner with PCN on this because the financial literacy is so important to bankers. Kids are not taught financial literacy concepts anymore, so our bankers are out in the schools throughout the Commonwealth, various levels of education, just trying to help prepare our children today to become more financially savvy, to better able to help them make financial decisions throughout their life, because it's just not taught anywhere. So we take that upon ourselves. We take it very seriously as part of our community outreach and financial literacy programs.
You serve on the Board of Directors for the Pennsylvania Bankers Association. What does your role entail?
So those things I just mentioned, it's to help facilitate that and to drive that from a strategic perspective as well as tactically carrying out those efforts. We do a lot of advocacy work, both within the state, but also with our Washington contacts and other bankers associations across the country. We work well together to try to continually foster the improvement of financial institutions and advocacy for financial institutions.
What do you enjoy about working in the banking industry?
So I've been in the banking industry 31 years now, and a little bit of background. You mentioned my job at Fulton Bank, so I am an information technology person. My degrees are all in information technology, so when I got my first job at a bank, I was thinking, wow, this is different. You know, at the time the only thing I knew about banking industry was, I had a checking account, a student loan, and a car payment. That's about it. But what I've really enjoyed working in the banking industry is you get to help so many people. Our banks in Pennsylvania are so committed to our communities. You learn so much about the communities that you live in and work in, and you're able to give back. And that's why I'm so passionate about this financial literacy, just being able to help more and more people.
So let's get to our main topic of the day, which is risk management. What kind of circumstances might necessitate the need for an emergency fund?
So I mentioned earlier when I described risk management, insurance, and emergency savings accounts. So insurance in the financial literacy perspective really are getting as much insurance to cover as many potential financial crises that you have. So your car, your health, your home. However, insurance doesn't cover everything. So for example, if your car breaks down or you need a new HVAC system in your home, insurance is not going to cover that. So that personal savings account is so critical to have. Now, the guidance is 3 to 6 months of expenses, and I know that sounds overwhelming. My advice would be to just start small and have that in your back pocket if you can. Life happens, things happen, and being financially prepared really prevents future spiraling. And what I mean by that is think about it, if you don't have that emergency savings account and you do have to purchase something new that's unexpected, you may have to borrow money to do that. And then you can get in this perpetual cycle that is not healthy for your financial situations.
You already mentioned the situation where someone may have insurance for various aspects of their life, whether it's automotive, healthcare, whatever. How do they determine where the insurance ends and where their additional needs may need to come from?
I think it's important to educate yourself on insurance. I think sometimes you hear about people assuming that their insurance policy would cover X or Y, and then they fall into that pitfall that I mentioned earlier when it does not. So it goes back to similar to financial literacy, understanding what your insurance policies cover, what they don't cover. I hear too often people are surprised when something happens. So I think, again, it goes back to that awareness and education of what it does cover.
Now, you mentioned there's a guideline, roughly 4 to 6 months, I believe, for setting aside an emergency fund. What kind of recommendations would you make, particularly if somebody's new in their career, they're just out of school, they don't have a lot of money? How do they start that savings?
I would just say start small. And, you know, I have a daughter, late 20s. I know they don't have a lot of money, but even I've encouraged her to start small. You know, even if you can start saving, 3, 4, 5% of salary, even 1%, I think it's critical to just start and then be disciplined over time not to touch that, because it's very easy to say, oh, I have this money over here in this separate checking account. Why don't we use that to buy something that maybe we don't need? But it's the discipline, the awareness, and just starting. Because if you don't start, you're never going to get there.
Is there a better place to hold that emergency fund? For example, is it better to have it in something like a checking or savings account where you can access it quickly, as opposed to something like a CD that has to sit for a period of time, but it
depends on your finances. So if you are able to just one fell swoop put a 3 to 6 month amount of your expenses into a CD, that's a good idea because you're not going to access it. However, most people, if your monthly spend is $5,000, $6,000, most people aren't going to say, oh, I'm going to take this $30,000 now and put it over into the CD. So I think it depends on your personal situation. If you are able to do that, I would recommend that because, like you said, you don't touch it. You know it's there, but you're not just going to use your ATM card to remove funds from that. So it does give you that more protection. But again, it depends on your personal financial situation.
We started out by talking a little bit about the need and importance for insurance. What kind of guidelines do you recommend for how much insurance somebody should take out for their various assets?
So I would say take out as much as you can afford. The more coverage you have, you'll be better able to prevent that spiral I mentioned earlier. So the more coverage you have, the less you might have to dig into that emergency savings account or, worst case, borrow to pay for that. So it depends on, there's so many options for insurance out there, so many places you can get it, so many types of insurance. But again, I'll tie that back to the education. Make sure you understand what is and is not covered and get the most insurance that you're able to afford.
As we consider protecting our assets, another topic that we should really dig into is that of identity theft. For those who aren't familiar, can you explain what exactly is identity theft? What does it look like?
Sure. So identity theft is really when someone illegally obtains your personal or financial information and then simply they pretend to be you. And that can take the form in many different fashions. They can pretend to be you online. They can pretend to be with your bank. I mean, just everywhere. Social Security, IRS. And that's where the scary part is. They can really take over your complete identity.
Are there other digital or electronic measures that somebody should be wary of besides being tricked on the phone or tricked into sharing the information in some way?
There's so many. There's so many ways to be aware. And I think that the topic of the day is be aware, be alert, because these fraudsters are just so good these days. They have improved so much that when you get a text or an email that looks suspicious, it used to be very easy to see. You used to be able to tell right away. They're so good now that they just look legitimate. So be aware of what you're getting and be aware of what you're sharing. It just constantly, you have to think of your identity as just so personal and so important to protect these days.
What basic guidelines do you offer so that people can protect themselves from having their identity stolen?
So through the banking situations or systems, there's a lot of things we do now that we didn't do 5 years ago. There are certain things like you may have heard EMV chip technology. When you look at your debit or credit card, there's a little chip on there now. That is a technological advancement that we have now that is harder to steal your information out of cards when you use those. Banks offer alert capabilities. I would highly suggest your viewers use those. So for example, you can go onto your banking system. You can set up alerts for many things, such as, okay, I want an alert every time $500 transaction comes out. What you also may not think about is you should also set up alerts for small dollar transactions. I want to know every time something $5 or less. That may seem silly, but what fraudsters tend to do is they it's a little bit like try and buy. They may send a small transaction through, like $1, $2, to see if it works before they do the larger fraudulent transaction amount.
How important is it for someone to shred documents that have their personal information?
Oh, it's critical. It's critical. A lot of the fraudsters now, you may have heard the phrase dumpster diving. They'll go through discarded information. So it's so important. Shred your information, protect that personal information that you have. And I also say, protect it through social media. When you think of how much you put on social media, or maybe you don't put it on there, but you read others, it's so important to protect that identity in that environment as well. So if you think about one of your security questions, maybe, my dog's name, but you're on Instagram posting all about Daisy day in and day out, you've just given the fraudsters a security answer. So just constantly being aware of how you're protecting your identity, all the different forms and mediums.
We've often heard in the news about a process called skimming. Can you talk a little bit about how safe it is to use your ATM card?
Absolutely. It is safe. However, again, you're going to hear me say this probably 100 times, be aware. So skimming, if you're not aware what that is an actual physical hardware device that is placed either on a fuel pump, a point-of-sale terminal, or an ATM machine. And 5 or 10 years ago, you could go up to an ATM machine and you could easily tell because it was a metal device that looked like someone might have built it in their basement and it was duct taped onto the machine. But now they're very sophisticated. It's very hard to tell. And what the skimming device does is when you insert your card, the fraudsters pull that information off your card rather than the ATM using it. So things that you could be aware of at the fuel pumps, try to use the pump that's closest to the building or the attendant, well lit, because that has less access for a fraudster to go in there and actually insert the skimming device. And on the ATMs, look for anything that's loose, damaged, doesn't quite look right. And if you see something, obviously don't use it, but also report it to the bank. Make sure that they know that you have a suspicion of what's in there. Use your debit card as a credit card. There's always an option for that. And if you don't, actually physically use your hand to cover if you put your PIN in, or some tips to use.
Are there particular scams that commonly occur?
Yes. I think phishing, that's very common these days. That's phishing with a PH, not an F. What that is you will get a text or an email from a fraudster trying to find out personal information about you. And as I mentioned earlier, they become very sophisticated. They usually have a sense of urgency. So it may be things such as, did you purchase this $3,000 TV on Amazon? If you didn't, click on this link. And that fear in people will be, oh, I didn't purchase that. I must click on this link to say that. It may be from the IRS, where you see that, we're going to complete this audit if you don't verify your credentials. So it usually plays on that emotion. And there are some things you can do to avoid that. You definitely want to take a close look at any email that you either weren't expecting or doesn't make sense to you. Look for typos, look for grammatical errors. You can hover over the sender. That's always a good indication, because if it's one of those IRS messages, but you hover over the email and it's from xyzgbt@hotmail.com, it's not from the IRS. So those are some tips from that type of phishing activity, just to be aware.
Since you mentioned agencies like the IRS or your banking institution, are there standard ways, for example, that banking institutions will contact their members so that you're aware if you get a phone call and say, hey, this is your bank, we want your social security number, you know that it's illegitimate?
Absolutely. For example, the American Bankers Association has a complete social media program called Banks Never Ask That. It's social media events, it's commercials. Just try to get the word out there. Your bank is never going to text you or email you and say, hey, we need your login and password for your online banking account, or we need your social security number. That is never going to happen. The only time you're going to have to do that is when you call into the bank and you're trying to be authenticated through a call that you have originated to try to get into your information. So be wary if your bank is asking for that type of personal information unsolicited.
What do banks do to help protect their members from identity theft?
Oh, we do so much. Being at a bank, being in charge of information security, we spend, and not just our bank, but banks collectively spend a lot of money and a lot of staff time dedicated to protecting our customers' financial assets. It is our number one priority. And it's also, I get asked a lot, what keeps you up at night? My answer is always cybersecurity, because it is. Even though spending a lot of money and a lot of people resources, and banks have multiple layers of security. So it's assumed that some of the fraudsters will always get in the first layer, but then you have your second layer, third layer, and so on. But banks also are just so focused on this. We actually have a better security record than other industries, like the power, medical, various industries. We are heavily regulated, which helps. So the federal regulators are looking at our programs all the time to ensure that we're doing all we can. So that's sort of internally. But externally, we have a lot of tools that we use. I mentioned like the EMV chip before. We're constantly exploring biometrics, which is where you use either your fingerprint or your retina scan or voice recognition, because no one can steal those. So we do a lot of encryption, where we're trying to protect the entire transaction. What customers may not know is when you originate a transaction, it goes a lot of different places and it touches a lot of different systems. So we're using more encryption so that we have more end-to-end protection of that transaction as it travels through the different systems and components, just various things like that. I think what's also important to share with your readers is we're also never complacent. We never say, oh, we have a very good security system, we're done, because the fraudsters are constantly, it's like professional whack-a-mole. They're constantly changing gears, changing the ways they do that, becoming more adept at what they're doing, so we have to constantly be vigilant of that.
How do banks educate their clients if they learn that there is a particular scam that's going through?
So we do a lot of social media when we are aware. So our customers can look at our websites. We do post that information. If there is a specific scam or event that we think will target our customers, we contact them directly. Again, not asking for any personal information, but just making them aware. I will say if you are notified that you are a victim of identity theft, it's very important to contact your bank, contact your credit card companies right away to make sure that everyone in that environmental system is aware. But we do a lot of outreach when we know specific information, as well as constant, just general education like we're speaking about today.
What's a telltale sign that someone's identity has been compromised? How do they find out?
So one thing that I will also give a tip is it's so important to look at your credit card statements frequently, to look at your banking statements frequently. I do think that certain generations we've lost that. I mean, I'm old school. I balance my checking statement, all the time to the penny. Whereas I mentioned my daughter earlier, I don't think she's never had a check register in her life. She's never written any transaction down in her life. But I've encouraged her and others to look at least weekly to make sure that the purchases both on your credit card statements and your checking accounts are in fact something you did. So just being constantly aware of that. And again, if you see something, say something right away, because it can snowball into things beyond your checking account. If people are not aware, it can immediately, if the fraudsters want to go and pull off a higher level identity theft with like the IRS or some government agency, it can spiral very quickly.
What should someone do once they learn that their identity has been compromised?
So again, it's very important to reach out. So if you do get a formal notification from a company, a vendor, you do want to call your bank and credit card company right away, but you also want to reach out. If you get a letter or an email saying you've been compromised, you want to call that company right away because they will have specific steps. They may offer some sort of fraud protection and monitoring for a year or two. You want to, identitytheft.gov is a really good website, a trusted website that customers can go to if they've had identity theft. It talks them through everything from filing a police report to how to work with the credit bureaus to either maintain your good credit or unfortunately sometimes get it back, but it's very helpful to reach out to that site as well.
What records should be retained regarding the fraudulent activity?
Everything. Every document that you have can prove it, because as you may remember when I started out, I said it's very hard to recoup your good identity. It can take years, especially rebuilding your credit bureau accounts. So any proof that you have that you did not make those purchases or you did not do that activity, you have to keep that.
If a client's account has been compromised, what can banks do to stop or at least minimize the damage?
So what the banks will do, and this is ironic because sometimes customers get frustrated, but the banks will immediately close that account. And some customers will be like, wait, I need my account open. I can't wait to get a new account. But it's really for your own protection because, like I said, it can spread like wildfire. So your credit cards and your banking institutions will shut those down immediately and then work with you to determine which of these charges on your account are legitimate, which ones are not. We've probably unfortunately all had that call where, did you buy $3,200 worth of camping equipment in Colorado? No, I didn't. Those type of activities.
What kind of educational campaigns or activities do banks provide to help teach their clients about things like identity theft and scams?
Yeah, we do a lot online. Like I mentioned, the American Bankers Association, banks adopt those programs that are offered more throughout the country. We adopt them and personalize them for our specific customers. We offer seminars to customers of different groups. So we might partner with someone who's going into continuing care facilities. We will go along with those people and have certain discussions around elderly abuse or what these people should be looking at from a digital life perspective. You know, it's interesting because COVID really was a forced catalyst for many people to start using more digital technology. I mean, when we think about it, think of how much you use technology to live your daily life, and it's generational now. You know, my mother is now online when she wasn't before. So we can no longer just look at a small group of people. We have to look at all of our customers and make sure that they're all educated and aware. Obviously, some we worry about a little bit more than others, and we do try to provide more targeted education for those people.
Well, on the topic of online banking, can you talk a little bit about the benefits and drawbacks of that, and are there added risks or protections of doing your banking online?
Yeah, so it's a personal decision, and I'm not going to. I could share my opinion, but I could not personally live without online banking. I mean, when I can sit down and pay my bills in 90 seconds as opposed to writing out checks, for me that's very personal and it's very important for me to be efficient. Others, they may have a fear of more risk of fraud, so they won't do that. It's very safe. I mean, using your financial institution's online tools are very safe. I will share, though, that you have to be aware in some situations. So, for example, you always want to be well aware of what Wi-Fi you're using if you're not in your home. So if almost everywhere now you go, restaurants, cafes, gyms, everywhere has Wi-Fi. It's okay to sit in the cafe and have a cup of coffee and scroll through Instagram. I would recommend you don't sit in the cafe with the public Wi-Fi and do your banking. So just being aware of where you're doing it, making sure it's in your home where you have a protected Wi-Fi. But at that point, it's very safe and very efficient to use those tools.
How frequently would you recommend that clients change their passwords on their banking and credit accounts?
And again, this is one that some customers are saying, you're crazy, I'm not going to do that, but very frequently. I would say at least once a month. And when you think about all the passwords you have for all the different systems, it's very overwhelming. We have a lot. The practice is to not use the same password for everything that you do. I know a lot of people that do that because it's hard to keep track. And then what happens is people will write them down and leave them places that they shouldn't. So it's kind of a catch-22. But changing your passwords frequently, making sure they're strong passwords, which is a combination of upper, lowercase, special characters, that sort of thing, long, that's very important. A good maintenance to have. And then unfortunately, if you are ever breached, you have to change your passwords, because what happens is some people have the false sense of, okay, I worked with the company, I called the credit bureau, I filed my police report, I'm done. Unfortunately, that information lives out on the dark web forever. And these fraudsters just sell this information among themselves, so you always have to remain diligent. It's not a one and done type of activity.
How important is it to check your credit report on an annual basis?
It's very important, and it's free now. 10 years ago, you actually had to pay for it, but it's free now. You can get it from all the different credit bureau agencies. You can get like Credit Karma. There's a lot of apps that you can now use that are safe to use. But again, similarly to my discussion about checking your bank account and your credit card, I check mine monthly. I just take a quick peek at it, see if there's any alerts, see if there's anything that I did not, if there's this inquiry on your credit and I didn't make an inquiry or I didn't apply for a new credit card, I call and question that. And it's very important, at least monthly, to kind of check that. It's so easy to do now online.
Do you have any last thoughts that you'd like to leave with our viewers regarding protecting their money?
I really don't. Other than what I've said, maybe to summarize that it's such an important topic. You must stay aware, alert, constantly diligent, being very critical of everything you get in a text and an email. And I think that's the name of the game. If you're aware, you have better chances of never having fraud perpetuated against you. And again, thank you so much. This is such an important topic, financial literacy for all our constituents.
We've been speaking with Angie Sargent, First Vice Chair of the Pennsylvania Bankers Association Board of Directors and Senior Executive Vice President, Chief Information Officer with Fulton Bank. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Financial Insights is a presentation of PCN and sponsored by the Pennsylvania Bankers Association.